各位来宾朋友们，你们好。Vice Minister Goh Wei-min, Editor-in-Chief Zhou Shuchuan. I have to tell you, Mr. Zhou, that I am now have had the privilege of working with China Daily for almost 20 years, and it is a great honor tonight to be with you and everyone here for the inauguration of Vision China. This is China Daily's new era. I have been working with China's leaders for almost 30 years, and sitting in the Great Hall of the People last October at the 19th Party Congress, and listening to General Secretary Xi Jinping talk about a new era, I knew instantly that I was listening to something very special, and I was going to dedicate myself after that to understanding deeply what China's new era is and what Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, what that meant. And so we have a new era, Xin Shidai. It's called a new historical starting point. And the starting point, if we want to pick a date, is indeed the 19th Party Congress of the Communist Party of China. Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. And there we are at the conference. So what is the new era? We're going to focus on that tonight to understand what the new era is and how Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, what that means. So let me practice. Xi Jinping, Xin Shidai, Zhongguo Tesa, Shuwei Juyi, Zishang. So the first thing I recognize is that the new era sort of comes first because the Xi Jinping thought, Xi Jinping Zishang, is for the new era. So in order to understand the thought, we have to understand first the new era, the context in which the thought emerges. So that's the orientation. So as I begin to think about it, I think about this new era, and Xi Jinping thought, what is it? Well, it's going to be directing policy from now on. So it's a policy energizing, policy directing way of thinking. And we're beginning to see some of those things, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. I like to call it a conceptual lens because it's like a pair of glasses that enables us to see the world in a new way. So it's a lens, it's like a telescope, but it's an unusual one. It's a conceptual lens that enables us to see further and what's happening. Now, in terms of a new era, there are many new things. It wouldn't be a new era if it didn't have many new things. But there are also constant things. And I think it's important to up front list what they are because these are elements that are not changing. And these are my ways of thinking. I'm not speaking for anyone officially. I'm an American. I don't represent the American government. I've been coming to China for almost 30 years. I have many friends in China, and I certainly don't represent the Chinese government. I represent my own thinking. And my own thinking is that there are three core interests that remain constant. China's political system, China's economic development, which embeds reform, of course, and national sovereignty, which is territorial integrity. So that's at the 19th Party Congress with one of our friends, Xin Xiaming. So we have defined the new era as this conceptual lens in which we're going to look. So what are some of its characteristics? Okay, I start with the concept there are differences. And I think the differences defining the new era are pretty sharp. And that's why I use terms that are different than differences. The terms I like are dislocations, disruptions, unprecedented complex challenges. As I said, I've been coming to China for almost 30 years. I've been analyzing China for maybe 25 years, and so I'm very familiar with the history of problems. And I can tell you that it is true today that the problems and challenges that China faces domestically and internationally are more complex than ever before. And the complexity adds to what this new era is. So I'm going to divide it into two big parts and then a third part, which is important, which you can see domestically. Now, everybody thinks the new era, and I put it first, is slower growth. And that's the prime characteristic of the new era, and that's something that I disagree with. I do not think that slower growth is the prime characteristic of the new era. And there are two reasons for it. Second reason, I'm going to give you the second reason first, is there are a lot of other things that we're going to talk about that characterize the new era. And for slower growth, I just want to throw some very simple numbers at you. So go back to the great days when China was growing remarkably, double-digit growth. And the last time that was occurring, pick 2004, 2005, roughly 10%. It was a little higher than 10% one year, a little lower, but 10% simple. What was China's GDP at that time? Roughly $2 trillion US. Okay, now we're in 2017. You know the growth rate was just announced, 6.9%, a little higher than what was anticipated and projected, so that's good. But what's China's GDP? What's the level? $12 trillion. So to be real simple, 6.9% times $12 trillion, it's a little over 800 million, I think 829 million, something like that, billion. So what you have under China's slow growth is a GDP that's 4 times the gross amount of what it was when China had 10%. This is not higher math. It's just based upon what the base that you're working off is. Now, there are other complexities here, obviously, in terms of growth rate and hiring people. And so growth rate is a legitimate metric. But it is not so critical because the gross increase from over 800 billion to 200 billion is on a population size that's not that much larger. So the gross contribution now is more per capita than it was before. So I only put that on it to show you that growth rate should not be the prime the sole characteristic of what a new era, the characteristics are. So these are other things that you've seen, you've heard it. Industrial overcapacity, endemic pollution, income disparity is a terrible problem, social imbalances, which is a different issue because you can have income and you can have social imbalances, two separate things. Social injustices, rule of law is critical, needs to be increased. Social service demands, interest groups blocking reform. Many leaders have said this for many years. China's biggest problem now is that many interest groups have formed. It's very natural, very sociological, natural development. But it is, in fact, the case. It's great wealth has been created. People have their interests, and well, they should. That's good for society when that happens. But that causes stagnation at times or impossible to make changes. Now, the last one to me is perhaps what I think is the most important, as opposed to slowing growth, which I dealt with, and that's people's rising expectations. A few months before General Secretary Xi Jinping took office, my partner Adam Zhu, who's here tonight, and I had a conversation with a fairly high ranking individual who we were with, and we were just asking whatever we could. We didn't want any confidential information. And he said, the team is ready, the new team is ready. He said, but what we worry about is our people's higher expectations. And that, I think, is one of the critical points of the new era, what people expect, generated by the growth that China has had, the freedom to think and use the social media and the internet. You guys know all of that. Internationally, whole bunch of problems. You know, this is, again, you read the newspaper every day. I don't need to say it. Regional conflicts, sluggish economies, trade protectionism, particularly in the US and Western Europe. We don't know what's going to happen. Have to be ready for it. Volatile markets, ethnic clashes, terrorism, geopolitical rivalries, territorial disputes. You know, these are all mixed together. I put corruption on the categories because, indeed, over the last 5 years, there's been a major effort by President Xi and his team to root out corruption. Remarkable progress, but still a lot to do. But that has been what led to that is also part of what's needed to define the characteristics of the new era. Okay, so during the 19th Party Congress. All right, so we now have characteristics of what this new era looks like. And what we want to do is look at some of the goals of the new era. And the way to do that, the way it's defined, is in terms of time periods. So I put them together because the goals and the time periods really are very close together. And you know, most of you are very well aware of the two centenary goals. Just to repeat it quickly, the first is the first centenary goal is 2021, which is the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China, which was founded in 1921. And the second centenary goal is 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, which was founded in 1949. So that's simple arithmetic. And because those numbers are close to a round number, we sort of round down the 221 to 220, and we round up the 249 to 250. So we have a nice 30-year period, and it's kind of elegant and looks right. These are adjectives. They're not really numbers. They're to define a period of time. So those are our two benchmarks. So if we have two benchmarks, we have 3 periods of time. The time between now and the first benchmark, the time between the second and the third benchmark. Those are 2. But so let's just go through the first one. So the first one is between now, which is 2018, and 2020. Which is the centenary of the party in roughly 2020, 2021. And for this, we can talk about many things. There were 2, traditionally, the primary characteristic of the Shaogang Shahui, the moderately prosperous society, was a numerical test, which was double the GDP per capita of, I think, 2010, 2020. Little under 10,000 US dollars would be that goal. A few years ago, another test was added to it, which I think is spectacularly important, and I've had the honor to be doing quite a bit of study on it, and that is the promise that all extreme poverty in China will be ended by 2020, by this date. And here's the way of thinking about that you can have a GDP of whatever per capita. You could hit your $10,000. You could be at $20,000 per capita. But if you have Chinese citizens living in abject poverty, you cannot call yourself a moderately prosperous society, Shaogang Shahui. You cannot do it. You have to bring all those people who are in extreme poverty out of that extreme poverty. Now, I'm not addressing the issue of imbalances, because that's a much longer period of time. We're talking about extreme poverty. So that's the first. Those were the 2 tests. At the Central Economic Work Conference just in December, there was a new innovation, and 3 big battles were described. So it's the first time. And there are 3. Controlling financial risk, poverty alleviation, which remained the same, and controlling or bringing down pollution. So those are the big 3, and they're targeted for 3 years for that period of time. So that's this first period of time. Now, the innovation at the 19th Party Congress was that this 30-year gap between the first centenary goal, 2020, and the second centenary goal, 2050, approximately, was divided in half. And so there are 2 15-year periods that China can judge its success and measure its programs by. And so we have from 2020 to 2035, in which China is basically becoming a fully modernized country, which were basically the same characteristics that used to be applied to 2050, but saying that it will be basically accomplished during the first 15 years, or by the end of the first 15 years. And so that by the second half of that 30-year period, from 2035 to 2050, that China will take these characteristics and sort of fully blossom them, prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious, and beautiful. And at this point, it is recognized that China, as China has been moving to center stage of the world, to quote President Xi, by this time, that process will be fully realized. So those are the time periods. And now is what I want to focus on for the main part of my talk to you tonight are the gut essences of what Xi Jinping thought on socialism, the Chinese characteristics for a new era, what this means in terms of the integration of what we've heard, many different ideas, and how can they be integrated? Because a lot of times you'll read the Xi Jinping thought, et cetera, and it'll be fairly general. And you'll have, you know, what is in there? What does it really mean? What are the different, how does it work? Well, I'm going to give you my opinion. Again, this is not official. It's just my own, you know, as we say, my own night thoughts, and you can evaluate as you see fit. So I'm dividing it into two parts. One is principles. What are the basic principles of Xi Jinping's thought for the new era? And 5 frameworks, which are 5 very specific things that he has said during this period of time, which I think come together and comprehensively, to use a word that we'll use again, describe it. So 3 primary principles, 5 frameworks. They add up to 8, which is a good number in China, quite accidentally, of course. OK, so we're going to start with what are the 3 primary principles. And I have 3. First is people orientation. Second is national rejuvenation, which was defined very early in General Secretary Xi's, even before he became president, a few weeks after the 18th Party Congress, when he talked about the Chinese dream being the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people. I define it as these 2 elements together, people orientation and national rejuvenation together is the exemplification or the description of the Chinese dream. And then I've added a third, which has been continuously strengthened, and that is the leadership of the CPC, the party, not only increasing its leadership, but purifying it in many different ways, not only anti-corruption, but bureaucratic work styles and a whole series of other things. So those are the 3 primary principles, and we're going to talk a little bit about each one. So in President Xi's New Year's speech, he talked about the most pressing concerns, and if you read these, every one is people orientation, education, employment, income, social security, health care, elderly care, housing, and environmental protection. All people orientation, that's his focus. Now, poverty alleviation, as we said before, is exceedingly important to him. And I have seen with my own eyes and waded through mud with my own feet to see this program. We're working on a special project, which I'm very happy to do. It's not easy work. It's not like elegant like this. But it is really important to really see how anti-poverty is working in this targeted campaign. It's not the purpose of my lecture tonight, so I'm not going to speak too much. But I can say, as much as I thought I knew China, I was overwhelmed by the commitment and the capacity of the anti-poverty campaign. If people here are Chinese and don't know it, it is a revelation. Every single poor family in China, every single one has a file on them. And I saw them in multiple provinces, Guizhou and Hainan and Anhui and Sichuan. And everybody has a file, and they're filled out once a month. Somebody has, and it all goes into Beijing. And in each case, there is a local cadre, an official of the party, often a younger person who has a mid-level career, and he goes to that poor village and spends 2 weeks with every there to really get to know people. I said 2 weeks, right? I lied. I just wanted to see if anybody's awake here. They spend 2 years. They go from their office and job, they spend 2 years in a village responsible for however many, 50, 100, whatever number of the family, they are responsible to bring them out of poverty. It's really remarkable, and as I said, it's worth a whole lecture to understand how that's working. And that only works because President Xi has said, which I thought was a remarkable statement in his speech in Vietnam at ASEAN, that anti-poverty is his most singularly important topic that he deals with. Oh, there are some of the pictures that we're out in the field working. National rejuvenation, I don't need to spend time. It's, strength, confidence, certainly Idai-Lu, the Belt and Road Initiative, which rightly President Xi has called the project of the century. Sometimes Chinese officials get enthusiastic and like to show how much has been accomplished in 2 or 3 years. Sometimes I cringe a little bit at that because if you expect results too quickly for these kind of projects, you could go off the rails. President Xi says it's the project of the century. It could be one of the most important things really in our memory. And now I have to take a minute and tell you a story. So in September of 2016, there was a Belt and Road Conference. It was in Xi'an. And I've been honored to be at all 4 major media conferences on Belt and Road, from the first one in 2014, a few months after he announced it in Urumqi, and then Quanzhou, and then it was in Xi'an. Now, and I was asked to chair a session. I'm always happy to do that. But not that day. I was really unhappy to be asked to chair that session. Now, why was I unhappy? Well, that day, at 9 o'clock in the morning in Xi'an, China, was exactly the same time, to the minute, that the first debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump was going to occur in the United States at 9 at night or 8 at night. And I wanted to watch it. You know, I have a family split between them. I don't want to tell you about that. So I really wanted to watch. It was like entertainment, the best possible entertainment for a political junkie like me. And I couldn't, because I had to chair the session. So what I said was, to kind of make myself feel better, and the more I said it, the more I believed it. I opened the session by saying, right now, as I speak, the debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump is occurring and wherever it occurred. But I said 100 years from now, people will forget about that debate, but they will remember this conference as one part of the Belt and Road, which will have, at that time, looking backwards, an enormous impact on the world. And China moving to the center stage. CPC leadership, you've heard a lot about it, renewing and purifying it, strengthening the role in all facets of society, corporations, universities, and what's to me most interesting, reaching out to the world. You saw a conference in the fall where the CPC brought political parties from other parts of the world to have a dialogue with the CPC. I think this is one of the best developments that I remember. I think it's another way of communicating. Okay, so now we've dealt with the principles. What about the frameworks? And there are 5 frameworks, and they're comprehensive. The first is vision, and that's the 5-in-1 construction that has been talked about: economic, political, cultural, social, and ecological. The second is on governance, and that's the 4 comprehensives. We're going to get into each one of these briefly. The third is on the economy, which is the new concept of development, which used to be called the 5 major concepts of development. And society, the principal contradiction, which was introduced at the 19th Party Congress, and how to deal with society. And international, you've heard, a community of shared future. So those 5 things, to me, are the framework of Xi Jinping thought that applies to the new era. So now we're going to talk a little bit about each one. What are the 4 comprehensives? Well, you know that, but I want you to take a little bit of a thought to see how it works. Let me check the time. So the 4, you know: moderately prosperous society, deepening reform, rule of law, and strict discipline of the party. But when I was looking at that, it sounded strange to me, because they're all kind of different things. They have a different literary character to them. Moderately prosperous society is a goal. Deepening reform is a means. Rule of law is a principle. And strict discipline of the party is like an action or a state of affairs. No, they're all different kinds of things, how they mix together. Moreover, each one has been done in the past. There's nothing new about any of them. Moderately prosperous society, I think, is like 15 years old or more. Reform is obviously 40 years old this year. Rule of law, maybe 20 years. In 1997, I think it began to be talked about. A strict discipline of the party, well, that's been always talked about, even before the founding of the Republic. So what's so new about this? Well, there are 2 new things here. 2 new things that President Xi brings together to make 4 comprehensive represent governance. Number 1 is the use of the word comprehensive, that there's a different way of thinking when you deal with the word comprehensive. Just take one example. Comprehensively having a moderately prosperous society embeds the anti-poverty. If you have moderately prosperous society without comprehensive, you can get away with a good income, even if it's not well distributed. The second is that by combining these 4 different things, you have a new way of thinking about the total governance of society. 5 major development concepts: innovation, coordination, green, open, and sharing. Again, any of these could take a full Vision China lecture. So maybe we'll do that in the future. But just briefly on these, innovation is number one. And that's not an accident. They're not in alphabetical order in Chinese or English, but innovation is number one. And innovation drives everything. Science and technology for sure, but more than that. But it's innovation in everything that's done. Number one, coordination is both geographically, you know, like the Beijing-Tianjin Hebei region, or the Yangtze River Delta, Pearl River Delta integration, or it's industrially in how different industries are planned. Very important. Green, for the first time, is at the highest level of national importance. China's always talked about green, but now it's at the highest level. Open. It's been opening for 40 years. Why do you need to be more open? Well, China is opening to the world through Belt and Road, and is opening up more and more of its own industries and own way of thinking. So openness continues to be important. Sharing, the question I ask, why is sharing that so important? Because disparities in income is so important. Why is that last? It's last because it's a natural follower for the others. You couldn't have sharing if you have nothing good to share. So you have to develop the stuff through the first four. When you have it, you need sharing so that everybody participates. The principal contradiction, which I found fascinating from the 19th Party Congress, principal contradiction is like a Marxist term that deals with the dialectical materialism, well, what's in society that's causing the most problem and how you can solve it. And during Deng Xiaoping's time, as you see, it's the people's need for things and no productive forces. So you just had to build the economy. Before that, there was a lot better than before that between the class warfare between the proletariat and the bourgeois and all of that. So Deng Xiaoping is a huge change for China, terrific. But now it's different because now more stuff is not that critical. But the key concept is between unbalanced and inadequate development, and here, the people's ever-growing need for a better life. That gets back to expectations. That material and cultural needs have grown, but new things like rule of law and democracy, fairness and justice, security, environment, all of that is important. So the new era contradiction, what that does is it drives towards qualitative growth rather than quantitative growth, and that's why I said that this concept of new era is a policy directing, a policy energizing concept, and the principal contradiction is there as well. Internationally, I used to have eight characteristics. You can read them, starting with a community of shared future, win-win cooperation. You can read the rest, economic globalization, new kind of global governance, new kind of big power relationship, expanding cooperation while managing differences, multilateralism, and people-to-people exchanges. But recently, the first, the community of a shared future, has been elevated above a whole series to be the most important and the drivers. That's why that's separate, and so we have the one, and then I have 7 others. There's nothing magic about the numbers. One minor correction, if I can offer my advice to the English translators officially in China, the term that you'll mostly see is a community of shared future for all mankind. And I can tell you that in the US, mankind doesn't work anymore. We got to say humankind. And I hope China can catch up with the agenda equality that we have, that we should have. China has always been, in fact, ahead at some point, but now linguistically, we want to catch up. So humankind is my recommendation, not mankind. Challenges of the new era. I have a few. I'm going to go through them quickly, but everything is not simple and quick. I have a few minutes, so I'm going to take it. And I just made 7 or so. One is the first question is can the government deliver enough social services and changes to meet the people's rising expectations? Because expectations generally rise faster than you can provide fulfillment of them. Second, financial risk is concerned, so can the debt be sufficiently reduced without seriously impeding economic growth? This is what we talk about very often in more technical lectures and conversations. Same point on pollution. How can you control pollution and still maintain growth? Third is the question of state-owned enterprise reform. Can it be substantially improved with governance and managerial professionalism without giving up state ownership? Some scholars think you can't. Most think you can. That's the government policy. It's an open question. Rural reform, I find one of the most important questions in China. When I first started in China, I had no interest in the rural area, but I've come to appreciate the deep significance of rural reform, rural land reform, the sophistication of collective ownership, which is 46% of the country is under collective ownership of rural groups and townships or counties, et cetera. And you have collective ownership, and then you have contractual rights, and then you have managerial or operational rights. They're three separate things. It's very complicated. Farmers have been taken advantage of. It's a critical issue to continue to follow. Will China open up additional markets? And then the last one is poverty alleviation sustainable? Because we have this enormous effort to bring all the extreme people who are in extreme poverty out of poverty by 2020. And then what? You're going to forget them? Maybe some will fall back. But if they're just over the poverty line, however you define it, they're still very poor, certainly compared to everyone in this audience. So that's still not fair. So what's going to happen after that? The people in terms of relative poverty. There's another scene we had in Guizhou. And that woman, was a no flush toilet, raising a couple chickens. It's quite serious. The last domestic one I have here is on the CPC. CPC has challenges. It's economic reform, guiding social developments, while at the same time improving its transparency, checks and balances, and building institutions within the CPC that are self-regulating. And again, it's an environment that is completely open with social media, so it's a real challenge. Internationally, we also have a number of issues. China balancing sovereignty with territoriality and accusations of China threat or perceptions of China threat, anxieties international. Trade issues, a second, I won't read them all. Belt and road problems, which will occur in the future one way or another. Maybe Chinese assets will be attacked, or debts or debts not able to be repaid. How is China going to deal with this on a long-term basis when it becomes on a continuing thing? And backlash against China, China's influence abroad, containment possibilities of different countries reacting to China's growth, China's proactive involvement in the world. I think it's terrific, and Vision China is a wonderful exemplification of that. But China, be careful what you wish for, because will China understand what it means to bear some of these burdens and assume responsibilities in an often chaotic world? These are real issues. And how then should China respond to suspicions or anxieties or worries in other countries? You have a situation where if I were here saying that all countries that I visit that I know are very comfortable with China's rise, if I told you that people are very comfortable and happy with it, I'd be telling you a falsehood. Now, I'm going to conclude with a couple of things President Xi Jinping said. First bullet, people orientation, pride in achievements, dangers of complacency, assessing ourselves objectively, and avoiding empty talk. That sounds like President Xi, and he might have said that last week. But when he said that, I was listening firsthand. Adam Jew, my long-term partner, is here. He and I were together with, at that time, Zhejiang Party Secretary Xi Jinping, saying exactly those words in 2006. So when the international media wonders whether President Xi is just making up nice things now because they sound good to mollify people, I can be a one-person witness to say, I heard those words directly in 2006. So if there's one message to characterize the new era, I think it is this, that under the leadership of President Xi Jinping, China set the trajectory in all vital areas of the country's domestic development and international engagement for the next 30-plus years, to mid-century, to 2050.